A growing number of lawmakers are throwing their support behind Vice President Kamala Harris in the race for the White House. In her first statement after President Biden announced he would not seek re-election, Harris said she intended to, quote, earn her party's nomination. One of the senior members of her party whose support she needs to earn is Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders, and he joins us now along with CBS News chief election and campaign correspondent Robert Costa. Bob?
Senator Sanders, thanks for being with us here at CBS News. We have learned, Senator, that you and Vice President Harris have had a conversation in the wake of President Biden's decision to step away from the presidential race. Can you describe where you stand right now in terms of a possible endorsement or not of Vice President Harris, and what's on your mind as you make that decision?
Well, thanks, Bob, for having me. I think that the vice president is going to be the Democratic nominee. I think she stands in a very tough race. I think she stands with the real possibility of winning this election and maybe winning it with a big vote. But the issue that concerns me is that for too long, Democrats have kind of turned their backs on the pain that millions of working class people who are elderly, children, lower income people are experiencing. And my hope is that if the vice president stands up and says, you know what, it is not acceptable that 60% of our people are living paycheck to paycheck while the billionaire class has never ever had it so good, that it's not acceptable that we've got millions of seniors who can't afford dental care, hearing aids, eyeglasses, that we have the highest rate of childhood poverty of almost any major country on earth, and almost all of the new wealth and income is going to the people on top. If she is prepared to campaign around an agenda that speaks to the needs of the working class of this country, she's going to win this election and win it big, in my view.
Senator, you have campaign stops to connect with working voters coming up this week in New England, your home region. Would you like to appear with her on the campaign trail in the coming weeks to talk about these issues? And as you assess her and her positions, what is your timeline in terms of whether you will issue an endorsement or not before the convention?
Well, I look forward to chatting with her again very shortly. We had a nice discussion the other day. But again, what I want to see, because I want her to win, is to speak to the needs of people who have been forgotten for so many years. So at a time of unprecedented income and wealth inequality, we need a Democratic Party. We need a presidential candidate who is prepared not only to stand up to the big money interest, but to fight for working people. And if she does that, I think she's going to have a great campaign. And certainly, if I were asked, I would be more than happy to work with her to make sure that she's elected.
Senator, you've heard the names being mentioned as possible vice presidential candidates by some of the party officials. Many of them being mentioned, as you know, are perceived as centrist Democrats, governors from the South and senators who are not necessarily embraced by every progressive voter in this country. Does that bother you that that emerging shortlist does not include progressive names? And would you like to see a progressive Democrat considered for the ticket? And are you open as a former presidential candidate and senator to being on the ticket? How do you see that choice and your own role, if any?
You know, what I think is we need a ticket, and I'm sure the vice president is more than capable of doing it. But we also need a vice presidential candidate who can speak in the language of working class people and articulate not only the problems, but the solutions. We need a vice presidential candidate and a presidential candidate who will talk about the fact that whether it's Burlington, Vermont, or Los Angeles, California, people can't afford housing. That we have, at a time of massive income and wealth inequality, 600,000 people sleeping out on the streets. That despite spending twice as much per capita on health care as the people of any other country, you got 85 million people who are uninsured or underinsured. And 60,000 people die every year because they can't afford to get to a doctor. People can't afford to get to a dentist. And on top of all that, we need a vice presidential candidate and a presidential candidate. And I know that the vice president will do this, to contrast our views with Trump's on the existential threat of climate change. Trump believes, unbelievably, and this is simply true, that climate change is a hoax created in China. Virtually every scientist believes that it's a result of man-made activity and carbon emissions. So we need to be having a ticket that contrasts on that issue as well.
And just quickly, Senator, on this point, are you open to being considered for the VP slot or not?
Well, I haven't gotten that call yet. I'll tell you when I get the call.
I'll turn it over to John for a moment, who loves history and politics as much as me, if he has a question.
Senator, it's good to be with you again. Do you have a fear that had Joe Biden stayed in the race, he would have been, at the end of his political life in his second term, would have been even less beholden to what you would call the big money interests? Whereas now, if Vice President Harris even were to win, she would have to think maybe about a second term, and that difference between the two kinds of presidencies means that there is less incentive for her and her team to fight the big drug companies and some of the other larger interests and the billionaires that you talk about.
Well, John, I don't think it works quite like that. The reason I strongly supported President Biden was not only because of his very strong record. He was the only president in American history to actually stand on a picket line during a strike with workers. And his agenda has been very pro-worker in terms of raising the minimum wage, supporting the PRO Act, which makes it easier for workers to join unions, appointing a very, very good Secretary of Labor, et cetera. The issue is that as a party, does the Democratic Party have the courage within a corrupt political system? Look, if there's anything we are learning right now, is that the impact of big money on both political parties. And I would like to see, by the way, the Vice President, Kamala Harris, begin to talk about the need to overturn Citizens United, that disastrous Supreme Court decision, which allowed billionaires to pour huge amounts of money into super PACs, move to public funding of elections. So I think that issue, whether you're Republican, Democrat, or Independent, people are not happy, whether it is Wall Street, whether it's Silicon Valley, whether it's just plain old billionaires spending huge amounts of money, helping to buy candidates. That is an issue I would hope the Democrats campaign on.
How can Vice President prove it to you that she is committed in the way you'd like her to be?
Well, we will chat again. Look, I've known the Vice President for a number of years. She and I were both candidates for president. We served in the Senate together. I like her. She is an extremely intelligent, articulate individual who I think would make a great president. But my goal right now is to try to rally the Democratic Party to understand, yes, we all believe that women have got to be able to control their own bodies. That's not what Republicans believe. We happen to believe in democracy. Unfortunately, many Republicans do not. But we have got to also focus on the reality that so many people in our country, working class people, elderly, kids, are struggling economically in the richest country in the history of the world. And we have a corrupt political system which is dominated by big money, which enables the people on top to get what they want passed in Congress. And what I want to see is a Congress, I know it's a radical idea, actually represent ordinary people rather than just billionaires.
Final question, Senator. Are you alone in this, or are there other progressives who would hold the same view you have, which is basically show me? And let me also add, when you say that the American government has turned its backs on working people, did you find anything similar to that message in J.D. Vance's speech? Because it sounds very much like the argument he was making about how Washington has abandoned working people.
Well, yes, that's right. He did make a few points there, which are valid. But you got a Republican Party. I'm in the Senate with Mr. Vance. The minimum wage today at the federal level is $7.25 an hour. That is embarrassing. That is absurd. We do not have one Republican, not one, who wants to raise the minimum wage to a living wage. Millions of workers would like to join unions. They're being coerced and intimidated by their employers because they don't have the legal protection. We don't have one Republican prepared to support a strong pro-act. Not one Republican who wants to expand Social Security or expand Medicare, or at a time, again, when the rich are doing phenomenally well, demand that the wealthy are paying their fair share of taxes. The problem with what J.D. Vance is saying is that he is in a party which, despite some rhetoric, is backing the needs of the wealthiest people in this country and turning their backs on working families.
Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont, thank you so much. And my colleague, Robert Costa. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you. Thanks, Senator.
Thank you very much.